The title of this Great Works episode is Voltaire to Vonnegut, The Problem of Evil, the Modern Novel, and Ancient Wisdom. I need to clarify some terms before we get started. First, I am using modern novel here in the broadest sense, wherein Don Quixote, for example, published in the early 1600s, is often considered the first modern novel. Part 1. The Problem of Evil. Philosophers and authors of religious texts have struggled with the problem of evil since the dawn of recorded history. But what exactly is the problem of evil? Let us think of evil here in the broadest sense of the word, such that evil refers to anything that causes human suffering. The question then becomes, why is there suffering in the world? According to the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, evil in this broad sense can be divided into two categories: natural evil and moral evil. Natural evils are events or occurrences which do not result from the bad intentions or negligence of moral agents. Hurricanes, earthquakes, and epidemics are examples of natural evils. By contrast, moral evils do result from the bad intentions or negligence of moral agents. Murder and extortion are examples of moral evils. Although this way of understanding evil is useful for the modern reader, we need to remember that the more one believes that supernatural forces play a role in human affairs, the less clear is the distinction between natural and moral evils. It appears that most of the religions of our earliest ancestors represented a form of animism. Animism is the belief that all living things, and perhaps non-living things as well, possessed a spirit or soul, and thus could be thought of as moral agents. Furthermore, any spirit might be good or evil, benevolent or malevolent, depending on whether it prevented or caused human suffering. In some cultures, animism was eventually replaced by polytheism. Polytheistic religions tried to explain the cause of evil by positing one or more gods who, when spurred by jealousy or anger, might cause evils to befall humans. Eris was the Greek goddess of strife and discord, and famously instigated the jealousies between Hera, Aphrodite, and Athena that led to the Trojan War. Some religions can be considered dualistic because they explicitly divide all supernatural forces into those that are good and those that are evil. One such dualistic religion, Manichaeism, became more widespread than any religion ever before it, with churches throughout the Roman Empire, Persia, and China, before being superseded by Christianity and Islam. Manichaeism viewed all of world history as a war between good and evil supernatural powers. Even in the setting of monotheistic religions such as Judaism and Christianity, authors of religious texts, not necessarily those contained in the Old and New Testaments, would introduce an evil supernatural being, namely Satan, to explain the moral conflicts amongst humans that could lead to sin and thence to punishment by God. In other cases, of course, humans might be punished by God for disobeying God's will all on their own, without any help from Satan. In modern philosophy of the last few centuries, the problem of evil boils down to this: why is there evil and suffering in the world if there is a God who is all-knowing, all-powerful, and all-loving? Of course, the theme of evil and human suffering is not a topic found only in the writings of philosophers and theologians. It is in fact a recurring theme throughout much of fictional literature. In this video, we will examine how 4 canonical novels since the Age of Enlightenment have explored the problem of evil: Voltaire's Candide, The Brothers Karamazov by Fyodor Dostoevsky, The Plague by Albert Camus, and Slaughterhouse Five by Kurt Vonnegut. I have selected these 4 works not only because they are among my favorite novels, but also because of the intriguing connections between them and between their authors. Furthermore, as we shall see, one can find in them influences from at least three major ancient ethical systems. But before we go further, why can I call them canonical? What exactly is a canonical novel? A canonical novel is one that serves as a recognized standard of stylistic quality, cultural or social significance, and intellectual value. Of course, just like candidates for the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, some selections are unanimous while others are debatable. Let's see what some literary scholars and critics have said about the four works under consideration here. Martin Seymour Smith, a British poet and literary critic, included Candide in his The 100 Most Influential Books Ever Written, The History of Thought from Ancient Times to Today. The Brothers Karamazov is widely regarded as one of the greatest novels of all time. Albert Einstein considered The Brothers Karamazov the supreme summit of all literature. Sigmund Freud called it the most magnificent novel ever written. Nobel Prize laureate William Faulkner reread the book regularly, claiming it as his greatest literary inspiration next to Shakespeare's works and the Bible. Regarding Camus' The Plague, one scholar of French and Italian literature recently made these comments. Albert Camus occupies a visible and seemingly invincible position in the Western literary canon. His novel, The Plague, with its narrative of epidemic and human powerlessness to stop it, feels particularly relevant in a world currently besieged by COVID-19. Although Slaughterhouse Five is not as highly regarded as the three other works under consideration, it was designated one of Time magazine's 100 best English-language novels published since 1923. As one critic put it, Vonnegut is still more cult favorite than Literary Lion, and he probably prefers it that way, but he deserves full canonical marks for this desperate, painfully honest attempt to confront the monstrous crimes of the 20th century. Collectively, these works provide a frank and unflinching portrayal of evil and suffering in its myriad forms. Yet, in his own way, each author delivers a message of hope, and, as we shall see, each of their antidotes to despair has its roots in ancient wisdom. Part 2. Four Modern Novels. My intention here is not to provide a comprehensive synopsis or scholarly literary critique. Rather, my goal is to give you enough of a taste of each work so that you can appreciate its significance and also get an idea of each author's distinctive perspective on the problem of evil. When trying to interpret great works from long ago, it helps if someone provides you with some relevant historical context. So, as we go along, keep in mind that Voltaire and Dostoevsky were both critical of the strict dogma of the Catholic Church and its history of persecuting heretics. We will examine a scene from Candide and another from the Brothers Karamazov, where each author depicts a fictional auto da fe. Auto da fes were formal public Catholic ceremonies that took place during the Spanish Inquisition, which began in the late 1400s while King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella were fighting the Moors, those Muslim invaders from North Africa, in a war to reconquer all of Spain. Heretics, especially Jews and Muslims who would not convert to Catholicism, were rounded up and burned at the stake in large numbers, while the remaining citizens watched and were called upon to express repentance for their own sins. The local church leader in charge of the auto da fe was known as the Grand Inquisitor. In order to better understand Candide, it also helps to know a little bit about the German philosopher Leibniz. Leibniz thought of evil in terms of both moral evil, sin, and physical evil, pain and suffering. Like many before him, he struggled with the question of why there was evil in the world. Leibniz believed in an all-powerful God, the creator of the world. Therefore, he had to admit not only that God created a world with evil in it, but also that he could have created a world without evil if he had wanted to. At the same time, Leibniz maintained a belief that the world created by God is the best of all possible worlds, because God would not create anything less than the best. His conclusion was that some amount of evil is necessary in the best of all possible worlds. As he put it, it may happen that an evil is accompanied by a greater good, and that an imperfection in the part may be required for a perfection in the whole. Voltaire was not persuaded by Leibniz's arguments, and so he set out in Candide to explore an alternative way of coming to terms with evil, while poking fun at the philosophy of Leibniz. Candide is a young man who has grown up in the castle of a German baron alongside the Princess Cunegonde. He is said to be honest, trusting, pure of heart, and unable to tell a lie. Both he and the princess are tutored by Professor Pangloss, a disciple of Leibniz, who teaches them that they live in the best of all possible worlds.
Pangloss was professor of metaphysico-theologico-cosmologology. He proved admirably that there is no effect without a cause, and that in this best of all possible worlds, the Baron's castle was the most magnificent of castles, and his lady the best of all possible baronesses. "It is demonstrable," said he, "that things cannot be otherwise than as they are, for all being created for an end, all is necessarily for the best end. Observe that the nose has been formed to bear spectacles. Thus we have spectacles. Legs are visibly designed for stockings, and we have stockings. Stones were made to be hewn and to construct castles. Therefore, my lord has a magnificent castle. For the greatest baron in the province ought to be the best lodged. Pigs were made to be eaten. Therefore, we eat pork all the year round. Consequently, they who assert that all is well have said a foolish thing. They should have said, all is for the best."
Anyway, just as a forbidden romance is starting to develop between Candide and Cunegonde, war breaks out between Germany and France, and the three main characters find themselves refugees fleeing for their lives to escape the atrocities of war. But their adventures are just beginning, as they find themselves in one dangerous predicament after another. The book is a travelogue of human misery, suffering, evil, and tragedy. Everywhere they go, they witness mass killings, rape, torture, natural disasters, and plague. But here's the twist. The book is meant to be humorous, and it is. It is a satire, and Voltaire is suggesting that evil and suffering are everywhere, but he is poking fun at the idea that suffering and evil are part of some grand design. Instead, he implies that suffering is due to people's own foolishness, superstition, greed, hatred, pride, and jealousies, or, in other cases, just bad luck. Like all successful satires, it is based partly on true events, but the story itself is so fantastical, implausible, and ironic that you find yourself amused instead of saddened. Through satire, Voltaire is able to create some emotional distance from all the suffering in order to ease the pain, if only momentarily. Here is one example. At one point, Candide and Pangloss arrive in Portugal after almost drowning at sea, at the time of the famous Lisbon earthquake, which occurred on All Saints' Day in 1755. Combined with the effects of the resulting tsunami and fire, the earthquake killed as many as 60,000 people, many of whom were attending Mass at the time. What happened next made the tragedy even worse. As one historian put it, the local religious authorities exploited the situation and the superstitiousness of the people, declaring that the earthquake was a punishment by God for the sins of the world. According to Voltaire,
after the earthquake had destroyed 3/4 of Lisbon, the sages of that country could think of no means more effectual to prevent utter ruin than to give the people a beautiful auto-da-fe. For it had been decided by the University of Coimbra that the burning of a few people alive by a slow fire and with great ceremony is an infallible secret to hinder the earth from quaking.
Accordingly, heretics were rounded up, including an innocent man from Biscay and 2 men who were noted to have left bacon uneaten upon their plate. When spies overhear Pangloss yet again explaining his philosophy to Candide, they find his views inconsistent with Catholic teachings and report him to the Grand Inquisitor, who agrees they must be heretics. Candide and Pangloss are made to dress up in ridiculous costumes.
They marched in procession, thus habited, and heard a very pathetic sermon, followed by fine church music. Candide was whipped in cadence while they were singing. The Biscayan and the 2 men who had refused to eat bacon were burnt, and Pangloss was hanged, though that was not the custom. The same day there was another earthquake which made most dreadful havoc. Candide, terrified, amazed, desperate, all bloody, all palpitating, said to himself, "If this is the best of possible worlds, what then are the others?"
As it turns out, Pangloss survived the hanging, and in the end, after many other misadventures, all 3 main characters and a few other secondary characters, including another traveling philosopher named Martin, are reunited in Turkey, where they live on a small communal farm. They are finally safe, but there is just one problem. They're bored. So, what's to be done, they wondered.
In the neighborhood there lived a very famous dervish who was esteemed the best philosopher in all Turkey, and they went to consult him. Pangloss was the speaker. "Master," said he, "we come to beg you to tell why so strange an animal as man was made." "With what meddlest thou?" said the dervish. "Is it thy business?" "But, reverend father," said Candide, "there is horrible evil in this world." "What signifies it," said the dervish, "whether there be evil or good? When his highness sends a ship to Egypt, does he trouble his head whether the mice on board are at their ease or not?" "What then must we do?" said Pangloss. "Hold your tongue," answered the dervish. "I was in hopes," said Pangloss, "that I should reason with you a little about causes and effects, about the best of possible worlds, the origin of evil, the nature of the soul, and the pre-established harmony." At these words, the dervish shut the door in their faces. During this conversation, the news was spread that 2 viziers and the mufti had been strangled at Constantinople, and that several of their friends had been impaled. This catastrophe made a great noise for some hours. Pangloss, Candide, and Martin, returning to the little farm, saw a good old man taking the fresh air at his door under an orange bower. Pangloss, who was as inquisitive as he was argumentative, asked the old man what was the name of the strangled mufti. "I do not know," answered the worthy man, and I have not known the name of any mufti, nor of any vizier. I am entirely ignorant of the event you mention. I presume, in general, that they who meddle with the administration of public affairs die, sometimes miserably, and that they deserve it. But I never trouble my head about what is transacting at Constantinople. I content myself with sending there for sale the fruits of the garden which I cultivate." Having said these words, he invited the strangers into his house. His 2 sons and 2 daughters presented them with several sorts of sherbet, which they made themselves, with kaimak enriched with the candied peel of citrons, with oranges, lemons, pineapples, pistachio nuts, and mocha coffee unadulterated with the bad coffee of Batavia or the American islands. After which the 2 daughters of the honest Mussulman perfumed the strangers' beards. "You must have a vast and magnificent estate," said Candide to the Turk. "I have only 20 acres," replied the old man. "I and my children cultivate them. Our labor preserves us from 3 great evils."
And what, according to the old man, are the 3 great evils that humans can escape through hard work? Boredom, vice, and need. Candide and his companions are inspired to go home and throw themselves into the task of developing a prosperous farm.
"Let us work," said Martin, "without disputing. It is the only way to render life tolerable." The whole little society entered into this laudable design according to their different abilities. Their little plot of land produced plentiful crops. Cunegonde was, indeed, very ugly, but she became an excellent pastry cook. Paquette worked at embroidery. The old woman looked after the linen. They were all, not excepting Friar Giroflée, of some service or other, for he made a good joiner and became a very honest man. Pangloss sometimes said to Candide, "There is a concatenation of events in this best of all possible worlds, for if you had not been kicked out of a magnificent castle for love of Miss Cunegonde, if you had not been put into the Inquisition, if you had not walked over America, if you had not stabbed the Baron, if you had not lost all your sheep from the fine country of El Dorado, you would not be here eating preserved citrons and pistachio nuts." "All that is very well," answered Candide, "but let us cultivate our garden."
Set in 19th century Russia, The Brothers Karamazov is widely regarded as one of the greatest novels of all time. The main characters are the 3 Karamazov brothers: Alyosha, the monk who has a strong faith in God and is a sensitive and caring soul; Ivan, the intellectual, who is tormented by the problem of evil and all the senseless suffering in the world; and Dmitri, who is the impulsive, emotional one. He has money problems, women problems, and he sometimes drinks too much. The story centers around the murder of the 3 brothers' father, and thus entails both a murder mystery and a subsequent courtroom drama. Above all, it is an extended exposition of how each brother grapples with human suffering in his own way. In this presentation, I will focus on a profoundly moving episode that makes up the chapter entitled The Grand Inquisitor, starting with a little background information. Ivan, the atheist, and Alyosha, the devout monk, have a close relationship built on mutual respect, for each recognizes that the other's very different worldview nevertheless represents a sincere response to human suffering, to which both are profoundly sensitive. At one point, Ivan shares with Alyosha a story he has made up. He calls it a poem, which is set in Spain at the time of the Spanish Inquisition. In the poem, Jesus is not too happy about this whole idea of burning people at the stake, so he comes down to earth to a town in Spain, Seville, where the burning of heretics is taking place.
In his boundless mercy, he passes once more among men in that same human form in which for 3 years he walked among men 15 centuries earlier. He comes down to the hot streets and squares of the southern town in which only the previous day, in a resplendent auto da fe, in the presence of the king, the court, the knights, the cardinals, and the loveliest ladies of the court, in the presence of the numerous population of all Seville, there had been burned by the Cardinal Grand Inquisitor very nearly a good 100 heretics, all in one go, ad maiorem gloriam Dei. He has appeared quietly, unostentatiously, and yet, strange this, everyone recognizes him. That could have been one of the best bits in my poem. I mean, the question of why it is that everyone recognizes him. The people rush towards him with invincible force, surround him, mass around him, follow him. Saying nothing, he passes among them with a quiet smile of infinite compassion.
The Grand Inquisitor promptly recognizes that Jesus is a rival for the people's respect and a threat to his own authority. He has Jesus arrested and imprisoned. He sentences Jesus to be burned at the stake on the following morning. That night, the Grand Inquisitor visits Jesus in his cell and undertakes a lengthy monologue in defense of the Inquisition and explaining why he has condemned Jesus. The Inquisitor's basic argument is this: Jesus made people miserable by expecting too much of them.
You desired that man's love should be free, that he should follow you freely, enticed and captivated by you. Henceforth, in place of the old firm law, man was himself to decide with a free heart what is good and what is evil, with only your image before him to guide him. But surely you never dreamed that he would at last reject and call into question even your image and your truth, were he to be oppressed by so terrible a burden as freedom of choice. They will exclaim at last that the truth is not in you, for it would have been impossible to leave them in more confusion and torment than you did when you left them so many worries and unsolvable problems. Thus, you yourself laid the foundation for the destruction of your own kingdom, and no one else should be blamed for it.
Remember Hamlet's dilemma. How should someone respond to the evil acts of others? Do the Gospels always provide a clear answer? I think it can be hard to interpret some of Jesus' teachings and apply them to real life. Take, for example, Jesus' second great commandment, love your neighbor as yourself. Sounds simple enough. However, who exactly is my neighbor? Can a Jew qualify as my neighbor? Can a Muslim? Do I have to love my neighbors always, even when they do me wrong? What if my neighbor steals from me or kills my father? And what exactly is my reward in this world for loving my neighbor? The Grand Inquisitor argues that the Catholic Church has solved these problems by interpreting the Bible for the people. Much of church dogma and tradition cannot be found explicitly stated in the Bible. By filling in those gaps and telling the people exactly what to believe and how exactly to be good Christians, the Church relieves the people of those uncertainties and anxieties. Otherwise, the argument goes, society would lapse into turmoil and people will continuously argue with each other. Christians will find themselves fighting not only with Jews and Muslims, but also with other Christians. In fact, bitterly disputed controversies go back to the earliest days of the Church. Even Paul the Apostle found himself engaging in openly hostile rivalries with other church fathers and missionaries in the struggle to establish a single set of beliefs. In short, according to the Grand Inquisitor, a single set of explicit and rigid religious beliefs is necessary to create a peaceful, harmonious society in which humans can enjoy sustained happiness. In order to convince everyone to follow the same set of beliefs, the Grand Inquisitor believes it is sometimes necessary to burn heretics at the stake. The Grand Inquisitor is essentially arguing that it is necessary to take away some of people's freedom, specifically their freedom of thought, in order to allow them lasting happiness during their lifetime. And the Grand Inquisitor is willing to take on the responsibility for committing this grand deception on behalf of the common people. Now here's the best part. Jesus has been silent the entire time, and when the Grand Inquisitor finally finishes his defense, he is just a bit afraid of how Jesus might respond. However, Jesus says nothing, but simply kisses the old man gently on the lips. The Grand Inquisitor is startled. Then, after a moment, he opens the cell door, letting Jesus escape, while telling him to go and never come back. During Ivan's recounting of his poem, Alyosha becomes increasingly agitated. Finally, he interrupts Ivan and protests that the poem is not a fair portrayal of either Jesus or of the Catholic Church. In truth, Ivan's poem is clearly meant as a criticism of organized religion. But then Jesus' kiss at the end is ambiguous. Is Jesus forgiving the Grand Inquisitor? Realizing that Alyosha is upset, Ivan asks if his brother is offended by the poem. Quietly, Alyosha kisses Ivan on the lips. Greatly relieved, Ivan says, "That's plagiarism. You stole that from my poem. But I thank you for it." To me, the Grand Inquisitor is ultimately a parable about forgiveness and mutual respect. This is not to say that forgiving someone is always possible, but Alyosha and Ivan are able to maintain an affectionate brotherly relationship only because each is willing to respect the other's point of view. After all, was not forgiveness central to Jesus' ministry? In Matthew chapter 5, Jesus, after reminding the people of the commandment to love their neighbors, he goes on to say, "But I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you." In the end, Alyosha stands out as the hero of the story. Despite being surrounded by evil and suffering, he never despairs. He remains true to his faith, and he is someone who cares deeply about others. What we learn, I think, is that for Dostoevsky, who considered himself a Christian, religion is not so much about beliefs, it's about attitudes and behavior, being respectful, being compassionate, and being willing to forgive. The book ends with Alyosha speaking to a group of children from impoverished families, to whom he has served as a mentor and guardian. He tells them, "Let us be first of all kind, and then honest, and finally let us never forget one another." And one of the boys responds, "And let's always go like this, hand in hand throughout our lives, and 3 cheers for Karamazov." And again the boys cheered Alyosha. My first presentation of these great works to IB English classes was a year or so before the COVID pandemic began, and so, as fate would have it, this book has become even more relevant than it was before. The novel is set in the Algerian town of Oran in the 1940s. As the story opens, the main character, Dr. Rieu, witnesses over a matter of days thousands of rats dying mysteriously and ominously in the streets of the town. Soon thereafter, he is called to see a patient sick with fever and large, extremely painful abscesses in the groin and armpit regions. Almost immediately, he is called to see another patient with the same illness, and then another and another. They all die within days, and there are reports of multiple other cases throughout the city. Dr. Rieu is among the first to realize that an epidemic of bubonic plague is sweeping through the town. In the setting of this novel, before the advent of antibiotics, there is no effective treatment, and the disease is almost always fatal. Those large, painful abscesses were called buboes by medieval doctors, hence the name bubonic plague. Despite the serious risks to his own health, Dr. Rieu is steadfast and undaunted in making his daily rounds to attend to the suffering patients and to do what little he can to comfort them. His dedication to his profession seems to be a simple matter of fact. He does not openly espouse any strong religious or moral principles, nor does he harbor any false hopes that he can do more than comfort the dying. Moreover, he doesn't seem to expect any special reward, and certainly no emotional reward for his unceasing efforts. In response to an epidemic that showed no signs of remitting, the local church leaders decided to organize a week of prayer to conclude on Sunday with a solemn Mass in honor of Saint Roth, one of many Catholic saints believed to offer protection against the plague. They asked Father Paneloux, a respected Jesuit priest, to deliver the sermon. A large crowd attended the Mass and heard a dire warning from Father Paneloux. Today the plague has its sights on you. The moment to reflect has come. The just have no reason to fear it, but the wicked should tremble. See him, this angel of plague, handsome as Lucifer and brilliant as evil himself, standing over your roofs, the right hand raising the red spear level with his head, the left hand pointing to one of your houses. You believed it was enough to visit God on Sunday and have the rest of your days free. You thought that a few genuflections would be enough to pay for your criminal recklessness, that it was enough to repent and let divine mercy do the rest. That couldn't last. God, who for so long bent the face of his mercy over the people of this city, weary in his waiting, disappointed in his eternal hope, has just turned his face away. Tired of waiting for your arrival, he has allowed this scourge to be visited upon you, as it has been visited upon all the cities of sin since the beginning of human history. Despite his strong opinion regarding the significance of the plague, Father Paneloux eventually finds himself struggling with his faith after attending multiple times to dying children in the city's hospital. Finally, after many months and thousands of deaths, the plague runs its course and comes to an end. The people take to the streets to celebrate. They rejoice while fireworks are set off in the harbor and skyrockets explode with bursts of color above the town. But Camus won't let the story end without one final bit of commentary from Dr. Rieu, which expresses an almost fatalistic acceptance of the inevitability of human suffering, but also a spirit of hope, courage, and compassion.
And it was in the midst of shouts rolling against the terrace wall in massive waves that waxed in volume and duration, while cataracts of colored fire fell thicker through the darkness, that Dr. Rieu resolved to compile this chronicle, so that he should not be one of those who hold their peace, but should bear witness in favor of those plague-stricken people, so that some memorial of the injustice and outrage done them might endure. And to state quite simply what we learn in time of pestilence, that there are more things to admire in men than to despise. Nonetheless, he knew that the tale he had to tell couldn't be one of a final victory. It could only be the record of what had to be done, and what assuredly would have to be done again in the never-ending fight against terror and its relentless onslaughts.
despite their personal afflictions, by all who, while unable to be saints but refusing to bow down to pestilences, strive their utmost to be healers. And indeed, as he listened to the cries of joy rising from the town, Rieux remembered that such joy is always imperiled. He knew what those jubilant crowds did not know, but could have learned from books. That the plague bacillus never dies or disappears for good. That it can lie dormant for years and years in furniture and linen chests. That it bides its time in bedrooms, cellars, trunks, and bookshelves. And that perhaps the day would come when, for the bane and the enlightening of men, it would rouse up its rats again and send them forth to die in a happy city.
Slaughterhouse Five is a novel about war and the long-lasting suffering it can cause. It tells the story of Billy Pilgrim and his experiences in World War II as a prisoner of the Germans, and of his life afterwards. Billy's time in captivity is semi-autobiographical, as Vonnegut himself was taken prisoner by the Germans in World War II. The book is also science fiction fantasy. Here is how Vonnegut starts the story of Billy Pilgrim.
Listen, Billy Pilgrim has come unstuck in time. Billy has gone to sleep a senile widower and awakened on his wedding day. He has walked through a door in 1955 and come out another one in 1941. He has gone back through that door to find himself in 1963. He has seen his birth and death many times, he says, and pays random visits to all the events in between. He says, Billy is spastic in time, has no control over where he is going next, and the trips aren't necessarily fun. He is in a constant state of stage fright, he says, because he never knows what part of his life he's going to have to act in next.
We learned very early on that decades after the war, Billy is captured by aliens, the Tralfamadorians, and taken to their planet where he is displayed naked in their zoo. On the plus side, Billy learns about their distinctive way of perceiving time and how it shapes their philosophy about life. When he gets back to Earth, he writes a letter to the local newspaper describing the Tralfamadorians.
The letter said that they were 2 feet high and green and shaped like plumbers' friends. Their suction cups were on the ground, and their shafts, which were extremely flexible, usually pointed to the sky. At the top of each shaft was a little hand with a green eye in its palm. The creatures were friendly, and they could see in 4 dimensions. They pitied Earthlings for being able to see only 3. They had many wonderful things to teach Earthlings, especially about time. Billy promised to tell what some of those wonderful things were in his next letter.
The 4th dimension, of course, is time. We will return to the lessons Billy learned on Tralfamador in a little bit. As the story unfolds, we learn that Billy Pilgrim was a chaplain's assistant in the U.S. Army and was captured by the Germans during the Battle of the Bulge. During their time in captivity, both Vonnegut and Billy Pilgrim witnessed the horrors of war, including the firebombing that devastated the beautiful German city of Dresden. The scenes of death and destruction are shockingly tragic and deeply disturbing. The question raised is this: was the firebombing necessary to defeat Hitler, or was it partly to avenge the Germans' prolonged bombing of London and the rest of Great Britain earlier in the war? A few years after the war, Billy suffers a nervous breakdown.
Billy had committed himself in the middle of his final year at the Ilium School of Optometry. Nobody else suspected that he was going crazy. Everybody else thought he looked fine and was acting fine. Now he was in the hospital. The doctors agreed. He was going crazy.
In a seemingly irrelevant interlude, Billy becomes acquainted with another patient who tells Billy about the merits of science fiction literature. Then, out of nowhere, he tells Billy something very interesting. He says, "Everything there is to know about life is in the Brothers Karamazov." Vonnegut sets an unmistakably fatalistic tone early in the novel. After the war, Billy sets up an optometry practice for himself.
Billy had a framed prayer on his office wall which expressed his method for keeping going, even though he was unenthusiastic about living. A lot of patients who saw the prayer on Billy's wall told him that it helped them to keep going too. It went like this: God grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, courage to change the things I can, and wisdom always to tell the difference. Among the things Billy Pilgrim could not change were the past, the present, and the future.
Billy feels like he has no control over his life. Vonnegut is raising the question here of free will. The topic comes up again while Billy is being kidnapped by the Tralfamadorians.
Where am I? Said Billy Pilgrim. Trapped in another blob of amber, Mr. Pilgrim. We are where we have to be just now. 300 million miles from Earth, bound for a time warp which will get us to Tralfamador in hours rather than centuries. How did I get here? It would take another Earthling to explain it to you. Earthlings are the great explainers, explaining why this event is structured as it is, telling how other events may be achieved or avoided. I am a Tralfamadorian, seeing all time as you might see a stretch of the Rocky Mountains. All time is all time. It does not change. It does not lend itself to warnings or explanations. It simply is. Take it moment by moment, and you will find that we are all, as I've said before, bugs in amber. You sound to me as though you don't believe in free will, said Billy Pilgrim. If I hadn't spent so much time studying Earthlings, said the Tralfamadorian, I wouldn't have any idea what was meant by free will. I've visited 31 inhabited planets in the universe, and I have studied reports on 100 more. Only on Earth is there any talk of free will.
The question of free will has always been a controversial one, and philosophers have argued about it for centuries. Regardless, I think most of us feel like we have free will, at least most of the time. And Vonnegut's point here is not necessarily that free will doesn't exist, but rather that he wants to show us how Billy might not feel like he has free will. After all, Billy was essentially compelled to join the war effort, but being a peace-loving soul, he tried to avoid the fighting by serving as a chaplain's assistant. Nevertheless, he winds up in the middle of one of the fiercest battles of the war. He is captured by the Germans and forced to witness the horrifying savagery of war as a prisoner. He is later kidnapped by aliens and held in captivity for their amusement. He is tossed helplessly back and forth through time. On top of all that, he has ongoing mental health issues. Mental illness by itself can sometimes steal much of someone's sense of having free will. Billy's sense at times of losing complete control of his life is a big part of his suffering. So Slaughterhouse Five is very much an anti-war novel. Its greatness stems from Vonnegut's skill as a storyteller, as he combines an unflinching portrayal of the horrors of war with the fantasies of science fiction, and from his ability to help the reader see the tragedy, the absurdity, and the dark humor of war all at the same time. Above all else, Vonnegut's compassion for the victims of war shines through. In particular, the lessons learned from the Tralfamadorians are intended to offer comfort not just to Billy, but to all earthlings. The Tralfamadorians had a hard time understanding what time looked like to Billy, since he could only see in 3 dimensions. The guide at the zoo where Billy was on display tried to explain it to the visitors.
The guide invited the crowd to imagine that they were looking across a desert at a mountain range on a day that was twinkling bright and clear. They could look at a peak, or a bird, or a cloud, at a stone right in front of them, or even down into a canyon behind them. But among them was this poor earthling, and his head was encased in a steel sphere which he could never take off. There was only one eye hole through which he could look, and welded to that eye hole were 6 feet of pipe. This was only the beginning of Billy's miseries in the metaphor. He was also strapped to a steel lattice which was bolted to a flat car on rails, and there was no way he could turn his head or touch the pipe. The far end of the pipe rested on a bipod, which was also bolted to the flat car. All Billy could see was the little dot at the end of the pipe. He didn't know he was on a flat car, didn't even know there was anything peculiar about his situation. The flat car sometimes crept, sometimes went extremely fast, often stopped, went uphill, downhill, around curves, along straightaways. Whatever poor Billy saw through the pipe, he had no choice but to say to himself, "That's life." The most important thing I learned on Tralfamadore was that when a person dies, he only appears to die. He is still very much alive in the past, so it is very silly for people to cry at his funeral. All moments, past, present, and future, always have existed, always will exist. The Tralfamadorians can look at all the different moments just the way we can look at a stretch of the Rocky Mountains, for instance. They can see how permanent all the moments are, and they can look at any moment that interests them. It is just an illusion we have here on Earth, that one moment follows another one, like beads on a string, and that once a moment is gone, it is gone forever. When a Tralfamadorian sees a corpse, all he thinks is that the dead person is in a bad condition in that particular moment, but that the same person is just fine in plenty of other moments. Now, when I myself hear that somebody is dead, I simply shrug and say what the Tralfamadorians say about dead people, which is, so it goes.
What is fascinating to me is that many physicists, including Einstein, have said virtually the same thing. In 1955, when his lifelong friend Michel Besso died, Einstein wrote, "Now he has departed from this strange world a little ahead of me. That means nothing. People like us who believe in physics know that the distinction between past, present, and future is only a stubbornly persistent illusion." Part 3. Ancient Wisdom. There are some intriguing connections between the first 3 works we have examined and 3 sources of ancient wisdom: Epicureanism, Stoicism, and the Gospels. We begin with Epicureanism. According to Epicurus, the founder of the school of philosophy named after him, The aim of philosophy was to help people attain tranquility, peace of mind, freedom from fear, and absence of pain. He taught that people were best able to pursue philosophy by living a self-sufficient life surrounded by friends. He did not deny the existence of gods, but he asserted the gods had no role in human affairs. He believed, therefore, that his philosophy was an antidote to superstition and fear of the gods. He believed that the negative consequences of immoral behavior were not punishment from the gods, but rather humans' innate sense of guilt. Pleasure was good, but he felt that pleasures of the mind were far more valuable than physical pleasures, and that overindulgence in physical pleasure inevitably leads to suffering in the form of ill health and a troubled mind. Epicurus wrote, "When we say that pleasure is the end and aim, we do not mean the pleasures of an extravagant lifestyle or the pleasures of sensuality, as we are understood to do by some through ignorance, prejudice, or willful misrepresentation. By pleasure we mean the absence of pain in the body and of trouble in the soul. It is not by an unbroken succession of drinking bouts and of revelry, not by sexual lust, which produces a pleasant life. It is by sober reasoning and by banishing those false beliefs which torment the mind." Epicurus is said to have bought a house with a garden outside Athens. Whereas the great philosophers such as Plato and Aristotle taught their followers at schools located in the center of Athens, Epicurus shunned the commotion, excitement, and politics of the big city. He preferred to discuss philosophy with close friends in the quiet of his garden. The garden of Epicurus thus became a symbol for the quiet, simple life advocated by the Epicurean school. Although Epicurean philosophy fell into obscurity during the Middle Ages, it reasserted its influence during the Enlightenment and helped shape the philosophies of deep thinkers such as John Locke, Thomas Jefferson, and Jeremy Bentham. Bentham was the founder of utilitarianism, whose fundamental principle was that, quote, "It is the greatest happiness of the greatest number that is the measure of right and wrong," unquote. With this understanding of the history of Epicureanism in mind, it becomes easy to see its influence on Voltaire, who spent the last 20 years of his life at his quiet country estate outside a small town near Lake Geneva. During that time, he frequently entertained visiting scholars and philosophers, and he wrote thousands of letters to friends from previous travels. His support for the Epicurean ideal of living in peace and harmony is evidenced in his essay on toleration, in which he wrote, "It does not require great art or magnificently trained eloquence to prove that Christians should tolerate each other. I, however, am going further. I say that we should regard all men as our brothers." What? The Turk my brother? The Chinaman my brother? The Jew? The Siam? Yes, without doubt. Are we not all children of the same Father and creatures of the same God? When Candide and his friends finally find sanctuary on a small farm in Turkey, and he says to Pangloss, "Let us cultivate our garden," Voltaire almost certainly was making a reference to the garden of Epicurus. We turn now to Stoicism. Stoics did not believe in supernatural beings. Rather, they believed that God was present in all of nature. The notion of an afterlife played no role in their ethics. They believed that virtue is the highest good, as they believed that leading a virtuous life was the secret for lasting happiness. Pleasure was viewed as neither bad nor good, but the pursuit of pleasure for its own sake was misguided and self-destructive. Instead, they believed that passions and strong emotions needed to be overcome through self-control and fortitude. Stoics believed in the natural order of things, and that included the idea that all men are created equal by nature. Therefore, one should respect all humans and be willing to serve them. Injury, disease, and death are part of the natural order of things, and so one must be willing to accept them as simply a given, without wishing that they did not exist. Despite the difference in their fundamental notions of the highest good, there is certainly some common ground to be found when comparing Epicureanism and Stoicism. At the same time, for our purposes, it is important to note an important distinction between the two philosophies' attitudes towards suffering. For an Epicurean, pain is something to be avoided. For a Stoic, it is something to be endured. Perhaps the most famous of the Stoic philosophers also happened to be one of the greatest of the Roman emperors, Marcus Aurelius. A few of his more famous quotes will help further illustrate some of the Stoic ideals. You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength. Reject your sense of injury, and the injury itself disappears. Stay calm and serene regardless of what life throws at you. Accept the things to which fate binds you and love the people with whom fate brings you together, and do so with all your heart. Life is short. The fruit of this life is a good character and acts for the common good. No man can escape his destiny. The only question is how best to live the time that he has to live. With this understanding of Stoicism in mind, I can't help but see Dr. Rieu as the embodiment of Stoic ideals. His devotion to his duty and his acceptance of his destiny, that is, of his assigned role as a physician, despite the dangers, is very reminiscent of the teachings of Stoic philosophers. Likewise is his ability to maintain self-control and not let his emotions overwhelm him. In fact, when Camus developed tuberculosis at age 17 and was told that he might have only 1 week to live, he turned to the writings of the great Stoic philosopher Epictetus for courage and comfort. When confronting adversity later in life, he found strength in the writings of Marcus Aurelius. Finally, we consider now the teachings of Jesus. The most direct route to understanding Christian ethics is to recall the two great commandments according to Jesus, love of God and love of one's neighbor. However, to fully understand the depth and richness of Christian ethics, it is necessary to study carefully the Sermon on the Mount, where Jesus attaches supreme importance to compassion and forgiveness. This is where you can find the quote that I cited earlier. Jesus said, "You have heard that it was said, 'You shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy.' But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you." Elsewhere in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus advises his followers, "Do not resist an evil person. If someone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to them the other cheek as well." I have already tried to make the point that Alyosha, the hero of the Brothers Karamazov, is the embodiment of Christian ethics. However, it is important to realize that the conflicting worldviews of Ivan and Alyosha no doubt reflect Dostoevsky's struggles with his faith. He was raised in the Russian Orthodox Church. He was a student of the Bible, and likely he remained a devout Christian throughout his early adulthood. Nevertheless, he became critical of church hierarchy and church dogma, preferring to nurture, as we might call it today, a more personal relationship with Jesus through the study of the Bible and Jesus' message of love, compassion, and forgiveness. Now we come to Slaughterhouse Five and ask the question as to whether one can find any influence from these three ancient ethical systems in the writings of Vonnegut? I would answer that question in two ways. First, I would emphasize that Vonnegut greatly admired both Voltaire and Dostoevsky and cherished many of the same values that they cherished. Furthermore, it is safe to say that Vonnegut and Camus shared an appreciation for the absurdity of human existence, an acceptance of the inevitability of suffering, and yet also a stubborn desire to persevere in easing the suffering of others through compassion and empathy. I believe that these connections demonstrate that Vonnegut assimilated, either directly or indirectly, or perhaps discovered on his own, much of the wisdom shared by all three ancient ethical systems. However, instead of trying to persuade you to agree with me by making a methodical, systematic argument, I will simply share a few additional quotes from Vonnegut himself and let you decide, accompanied by some of Vonnegut's own whimsical drawings. Vonnegut considered himself a humanist, and he once identified Voltaire as the Abraham of humanism. Here is Vonnegut's attempt to define the essence of humanism. I am honorary president of the American Humanist Association. Humanists try to behave decently and honorably without any expectation of rewards or punishments in an afterlife. The Creator of the universe has been to us unknowable so far. We serve as well as we can the highest abstraction of which we have some understanding, which is our community. If it weren't for the message of mercy and pity in Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, I wouldn't want to be a human being. I would just as soon be a rattlesnake. Although Slaughterhouse Five is deservedly considered an anti-war novel, we can guess that Vonnegut would say that the war against Hitler and Nazism was a war worth fighting. He wrote, "There are plenty of good reasons for fighting, but no good reason ever to hate without reservation. To imagine that God Almighty himself hates with you too." In one of his many other novels, Vonnegut's protagonist is planning a baptismal speech for his neighbor's newborn twins, and the speech goes like this. "Hello, babies. Welcome to Earth. It's hot in the summer and cold in the winter. It's round and wet and crowded. At the outside, babies, you've got about 100 years here. There's only one rule that I know of, babies. God damn it, you've got to be kind." In his last novel, Timequake, which is semi-autobiographical, Vonnegut poses the following question to himself with regard to his motivation for being a writer, in spite of his fairly pessimistic worldview. Why bother, he asks himself. His response? Many people need desperately to receive this message. I feel and think much as you do, care about many of the things you care about, although most people do not care about them. You are not alone. Elsewhere he said, "Do you realize that all great literature is all about what a bummer it is to be a human being? Isn't it such a relief to have somebody say that?" Finally, here is perhaps Vonnegut's favorite piece of advice. I urge you to please notice when you are happy and exclaim or murmur or think at some point, "If this isn't nice, I don't know what is."